Another day, another story. The gold. Part 2. Gold during the primitive period, 5000 BC to 600 BC, and the gold of that land is good. Genesis chapter 2 verse 12. Gold was probably the first metal known to the early hominids that, on finding it as nuggets and spangles in the soils and stream sands, were undoubtedly attracted by its intrinsic beauty, great malleability, and virtual indestructibility. As tribal development progressed through the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic ages, and as people congregated into civilized centers, the metal appears to have taken on a sacred quality because of its enduring character, immortality, being worn initially probably as amulets and later fashioned into religious objects, idols. By the time of the early Indus, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, etc., Sumerian, and Egyptian civilizations, 3000–2000 BC, gold had not only retained its sacred quality but had become the symbol of wealth and social rank, the royal metal. Homer, circa 1000 BC, in the Iliad and Odyssey, the epic poems of ancient Greece, mentions gold repeatedly both as a sign of wealth among mortals and as a symbol of splendor among the immortals. Early references to the first discovery of gold are essentially legendary or mythical. Thus, Cadmus, the Phoenician, is said by some early writers to have discovered gold. Others say that Thos, a Taurian king, first found the precious metal in the Pangaeus Mountains in Thrace. The Chronicum Alexandrinum, AD 628, ascribes its discovery to Mercury, Roman god of merchandise and merchants, the son of Jupiter, or to Pissus, king of Italy, who, quitting his own country, went into Egypt. Similar legends and myths concerning the initial discovery of gold are extant in the ancient literature of the Hindus, the Vedas, as well as in that of the ancient Chinese and other peoples. In fact, the discovery of the element we call gold is lost in antiquity. The principal source of gold in primitive times was undoubtedly stream placers, although there is considerable evidence in certain gold belts, e.g., Egypt and India, Kolar, that alluvial deposits, auriferous gosens, and the near-surface parts of friable, oxidized, veins were mined. The alluvial and alluvial placers were worked in the crudest manner by panning or the simplest form of sluicing. The auriferous gosens and exposed parts of friable veins were simply grubbed out, gophered, trenched, or pitted along their strike length with the crudest of tools, stone hammers, antler picks, and bone and wooden shovels. Only rarely were adits, simple shafts, and drifts attempted, and then only in the soft rocks of the zone of oxidation. Only rarely were adits, simple shafts, and drifts attempted, and then only in the soft rocks of the zone of oxidation. Fire setting was probably employed by the ancient Egyptians, Semites, Indians, and others to break up the hard quartz veins, although there is only limited evidence to support this contention. Size or grade of deposit made little difference. Both small and large deposits that showed free gold visibly or in the pan were worked, a circumstance permitted by the low cost of maintenance of slaves, convicts, and prisoners of war who were assigned by those in authority to the gold placers and mines. Gold deposits in primitive times. Early references to the geology, mining, and metallurgy of gold appear in ancient Egyptian codes, on stelae, and in pictograms and inscriptions in the tombs of the pharaohs. In the Code of Menes, circa 3100 BC, founder of the first Egyptian dynasty, it was decreed that 1 part of gold is equal to 2 1/2 parts of silver in value, an indication of the marked abundance of gold and the relative scarcity of silver at the time. The inscription in the temple at Edfu, Egypt, depicting an epistle to Seti I, 19th dynasty, circa 1320 BC, from the sun god reads, "I have given thee the gold countries, given thee what is in them of electrum, lapis lazuli, and malachite." A citation recording the extensive prospecting and mining for gold carried out by Seti I in Egypt, Nubia, and Sinai. The most ancient geological map known, the famous La Carte des Mines d'Or, in the Turin Museum, is a Ramesside papyrus and fragments, depicting a gold mining region active about the time of Seti I circa 1320 BC. On it are located roads, miners' houses, gold mines, quarries, auriferous mountains, and so on. The exact site shown on the map is problematical, Some authors have suggested the mines represented are those of the Wadi Karim or the Wadi Hammamat on the Quina-Qusayr Road. Gardner, 1914. Ball, 1942, and Derry, 1951, say that the area represented on the map is the Wadi Fawakir in which the El Cid gold mine is situated. The ancient Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian civilizations utilized gold extensively, but their sources of the precious metal are relatively uncertain. Placers in the upper reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were probably the principal source, although acquisition through trade with the early civilizations of Arabia, Iran, Elam, the Oxus, Altai Mountains, and India cannot be ruled out. The ancient civilizations of Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and others of the Indus Valley also knew and used gold, its source being probably placers in the upper reaches of the Indus River and its various tributaries or through trade with the ancient peoples of Afghanistan, Baluchistan, and northern, eastern, and southern India. References to gold and gold mining are numerous in the Old Testament of the Hebrews. In fact, gold is the first metal mentioned in the Hexateuch, which includes Genesis, the narrative of which was probably first cast into written form in the 10th century BC. 6 sources of gold are mentioned in the Old Testament: Havilah, Ophir, Sheba, Midian, Uphaz, and Parvaim. The exact locations of all 6 are problematical and have given rise to much speculation. Some authorities claim that all 6 sources are Arabian. Others have suggested locations much farther afield. In Genesis chapter 2 verses 10 to 12, all biblical quotations are from the Authorized King James Version of the Holy Bible, edition of 1611, or from the Vulgate edition in the case of the books of the Maccabees. It is written, "And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted, and became into 4 heads. The name of the first is Pison. That is it which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. There is beryllium and the onyx stone." There has been much speculation as to the location of the land of Havilah, the most probable from a geological viewpoint being that the river Pison is the modern Kora, which drains into the Black Sea near Batumi, and that Havilah is the Pontic goldfield near Trabzon, Turkey. This field is also probably one of the sites where Jason and the Argonauts sought the Golden Fleece, because within historical times placer miners used sheep's fleeces in this and other fields to catch the gold in their crude sluices. Another location often suggested is a site north of the ancient site of Babylon between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. The statement in Genesis that the gold was good, probably meaning relatively pure, suggests a placer source for the metal. No placers, so far as can be ascertained, ever existed near Babylon, although it should be remarked that placers may have been worked near the headwaters of both the Euphrates and Tigris in the mountainous areas of Armenia, eastern Turkey. Of these various locations, the Pontic goldfield would seem to be the more probable location of Havilah. There has also been much speculation as to the location of Ophir, the fabulously rich land of gold from which King Solomon's Phoenician, Tharshish, navy brought large amounts of the metal, some 34 metric tons, to his kingdom. In Genesis chapter 10 it is associated with Havilah and Seba. The former, as just noted, was probably the Pontic goldfield on the south shore of the Black Sea. A location that may account for the long period of time, some 3 years, to make the voyage from Ezion Geber at the head of the Gulf of Aqaba to Ophir and back. 1 Kings chapter 10 verse 22. The cargoes mentioned amug, sandalwood, trees, precious stones, ivory, apes, and peacocks suggest circumnavigation of Africa. Tharshish or Tarshish, a region centered on Cadiz, suggests that the gold may have come from Spain, and specifically from the oxidized deposits of the Huelva region where the modern mining town of Tharsis, often equated with Tarshish, is located. Supportive evidence is found in the first book of the Maccabees, I-Mace 8-13, that mentions the gold and silver mines of Spain. Other possibilities are East Africa, principally Zimbabwe and specifically the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, where some think King Solomon's mines and metallurgical plants were located. Still other possibilities suggested for the site of King Solomon's mines are southern Turkey, Taurus Mountains, northwest Saudi Arabia, the land of the ancient Midians and possibly the El Dorado of the Hebrews. Sudan, ancient Nubia. Nub means gold in ancient Egyptian. Altai, Purrington, 1903, Ethiopia. Along the coast between ancient Adulis and Bab el-Mandeb, whose natives called themselves Afates, India, possibly the Kolar region. Cuba, Peru, the Far East, particularly Japan, Arctic Canada, and 100 other places. The story of Ophir is well told by Rickard, 1932, and Sutherland, 1969. The history of the ancient Zimbabwean, Rhodesian, gold mines and of the ruins of Great Zimbabwe is related in fascinating detail by Summers, 1969. Sheba, whose queen brought King Solomon great store, 6 metric tons, of gold. 1 Kings chapter 10 verse 10, corresponds to modern Yemen, where ancient alluvial placers may have occurred in association with oxidized zones of copper and lead sulfide deposits. It seems more probable, however, that the Queen of Sheba obtained much of her gold from Punt, which can be equated with the auriferous areas in the countries bordering the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, Sudan, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somalia, and possibly also with Zimbabwe. It was from these areas in Punt that the Egyptian navy in Queen Hatshepsut's time, 1503 to 1482 BC, and later brought great stores of gold and stibnite, to Egypt. Midian, often considered the El Dorado of the Hebrews, occupies the northernmost coastal district of Hejaz, Saudi Arabia, on the Red Sea and its Gulf of Aqaba. This area apparently abounded in gold in biblical times, as witnessed by the quotations in Numbers chapter 31 verses 50 to 54. Relating to the spoil of gold taken by the Israelites after the First Midianite War, and by the statements in Judges chapter 8 verses 24 to 27 describing the golden tribute accepted by Gideon after the conquest of Midian. Much of the gold of Midian appears to have come from oxidized gold quartz deposits that were worked to considerable depths in ancient times. Burton, 1979. The two other sources of gold mentioned in the Old Testament, Uphaz, Jeremiah chapter 10 verse 9, Daniel chapter 10 verse 5, and Parvaim, 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 6, couldn't be identified from any of the references. It seems probable that they were located in the auriferous regions of western Arabia. The numerous references to gold and silver in the Old Testament attest to the importance of the metals in biblical times. In the majority of cases when the two precious metals are mentioned together, silver comes first, reflecting perhaps a very early period when gold was less valued than silver. A situation perhaps confirmed by the fact that most of the gold in very ancient times came from placers, whose dust and nuggets contained only minor amounts of silver. Later, as argentiferous galena deposits were worked, probably in Punt, Arabia, Attica, the Aegean, Asia Minor, Thrace, Macedonia, and elsewhere, silver apparently became plentiful so that by Solomon's time, the metal was nothing accounted of. 1 Kings chapter 10 verse 21, and the king made silver to be in Jerusalem as stones. 1 Kings chapter 10 verse 27. Geological references to gold and silver are relatively rare in the Old Testament. In the book of Job it is stated, "Surely there is a vein for the silver, and a place for gold where they find it." Job 28:1. And, as for the earth, it hath dust of gold. Job chapter 28 verses 5 to 6, quotations that contain, albeit naively, two of the loftiest truths concerning the occurrence of gold and silver, namely in veins and in placers. There is some evidence from ancient writings and workings that gold placers and residual, oxidized, deposits were exploited sporadically in antiquity in the many islands of the Aegean, Thasos, Samos, Siphanos, in Anatolia, Lydia, and the Troad, Troy, in Thrace, Macedonia, and Arcadia. In the area bordering the southern shore of the Black Sea, Pontus Euxinus, in Cappadocia, central Turkey, in Bactria, upper reaches of the Oxus River, in Middle Asia, Tian Shan and Altai Mountains, and perhaps in Dacia, Transylvania. Much gold also appears to have been won in Spain, probably from a variety of deposits in areas, Huelva, Almeria. India, particularly southern India, has long been known for its auriferity, where in ancient times much gold was won from alluvial placers and from the oxidized outcrops of veins. Diodorus Siculus, in his Bibliotheca Historica written in the 1st century BC, says that in India the earth contains rich underground veins of many kinds, including many of silver and gold. Likewise in China gold was sought and utilized during the early Shang civilization, 1800 to 1027 BC, of the Huanghe, Yellow, River, the precious metal being obtained principally from placers in the hinterlands of this great river system and possibly also from placers in Mongolia. Mills, 1916, suggests that gold mining, placering, was probably introduced into Korea in 1122 BC by the followers of Qi Ya, who migrated from China. From Korea, the methods of alluvial and alluvial placering for gold were taken to Japan, probably as early as 660 BC, Bromehead, 1942. Later, during the first centuries of the Christian era, gold assumed much greater importance in the Olmec, Zapotec, Mayan, Aztec, and other civilizations of Mexico and Mesoamerica and in the Inca civilization of South America. Gold was not prized by the Amerindians of Canada and the United States, and the Aborigines of Australia seem not to have paid any attention to the precious metal. To summarize, gold was probably the first metal known to humankind, and references to it have appeared almost from the birth of writing. All of the first civilizations prized and utilized gold and sought the precious metal in their lands and suzerainties or through trade. References to the geological setting of gold deposits are sparse in the pre-classical literature, but the most ancient of geological maps known portrays an auriferous region in Egypt.